First of all, I would like to welcome you all to the second ever Fixfest UK. In the first edition, which took place in 2018 in Manchester, 59 of you join us in a cold but very creative space. We were supposed to be convening this event uh, in uh, in Glasgow on the 20th of June. And as you know, obviously that's not possible. But we want to first send a big wave and shout out to our friends at Repair Cafe Glasgow, who were set and really excited to be our hosts. Instead, they will co-host our Saturday social here exactly on that day, on the 20th of June. And we're looking forward to that session. We're hoping that Fixfest UK can accommodate more people and people who might not have been able to travel up to Glasgow if we had to be all there on the same day. And actually, we are very excited that we can run an event where people can attend in various forms, sometimes joining in on the moment, sometimes being able to catch up to sessions that they might have not been able to join live. So we're actually trying to make the most of this opportunity and making it possibly even more inclusive and welcoming this time around, as we can't be physically in the same space. So we're delighted to welcome you from all over the UK, from Northern Ireland, from Scotland, and from Wales and across England. I'm reminded by my colleagues that we are this evening testing out for the first time this platform, conf.co, and hopefully the setup will work fine. If there's any problem, we'll try to do our best. What I'll do for now is to start by turning off participants' videos just to make it easier and to reduce potentially the bandwidth implications for some of us, and allow speakers to be able to use video and audio, obviously. And there will be ways for everyone to interact as the session continues. So if you see the video being turned off, it's not magic, it's me doing it just now. Hopefully it will have worked. Our grassroots movement is almost entirely volunteer driven, and it seems fitting that this week is Volunteers Week. As a way to celebrate this great movement. Those of us who are lucky enough to get paid to do this work have a duty to all of you who are putting all of your efforts at weekends, in the evenings, and at times having to juggle through multiple family and other duties to build spaces of exchange, of inspiration, and of movement building. Half of the program that we'll go through from today all the way to the 9th of July was suggested by you, and we encourage you to fully participate and engage. Please reach out on the chat if we can help make that happen, or if you're having trouble. Technical support is also available through the question mark button at the top right at any time during a live session. All sessions will be recorded and shared, and that will help those of us that couldn't make a specific session to catch up, as I mentioned. We're very grateful to Nesta and DCMS, who funded both editions of Fixfest UK. Nesta have been a great ally as well for us and our work. Before we hand over the floor to our keynote speaker, Josh Babarinde, which will be followed by a session on the right to repair in the UK, we wanted to reflect on this last week and the times we're living. Oftentimes, we've been emphasizing publicly and very much the importance of our work in environmental terms, the environmental impact of repair, and why we think we need to prevent waste. But we're also very keenly concerned with issues of fairness and the social power that repair has to bring people together. Events that occurred in the US recently have forced us to reflect a lot deeper on racism and our duty to build a radically open and welcoming movement. This has been an ongoing conversation for us and as an organization, as the Restore Project, for a long time, and we hope it's been yours too. But we feel we need to do a lot more, and it's not enough to just think about it. We need to really act on all of this. When it comes to the environment, we approach with two lenses our work, the individual and the system change frame. It's not enough to fix a laptop or a sewing machine. We have to fix the system, the system that allows products to be made in ways that are often not repairable. But the same logic must be applied to fighting against racism. It's important that we push back in all of its forms, both as an individual level and our individual behaviors, but actually we need to recognize the system that perpetuates it over and over again. We're truly grateful tonight to have Josh with us to bring some of the reality of young people in East London learning to repair. He'll tell us the story of his organization and what inspired him and what he sees from his perspective. Josh is founder and CEO of Cracked, London's smartphone repair service staffed by young exoverts. Josh and his social enterprise have won many awards for social entrepreneurship from Forbes, the Center for Social Justice, and the Evening Standard. Tonight, I believe Josh is joining us from Eastbourne. And over to you, Josh. We're excited to have you with us.
Thank you very much. It's an absolute delight to be joining you. I'm just going to put my presentation on. And it would be good, because I now can't see you on the screen. If Hugo, you could just confirm that you can see my title slide.
I can see it, confirmed.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Well, it's a real delight to join fixers, not just from across the UK, but from across the world. I'm reading in the comments at Fixfest. I've heard a lot and engaged with the Restart Project, who I'm really thanking this event for some years now. Really admire the work and the work of the fixing community more generally, and I'm a proud part of it through Cracked It. And I'm going to explain a little bit about what Cracked It caught of my remarks, but I'm going to enter them by what the repair journey was, I guess. We've all got different routes into this wonderful field that is repair, that is fixing, different windy routes. And for me, it certainly wasn't the one I expected to be entering. My repair journey started with an interest in how to tackle the issue of youth violence in London. Many of you will be aware that it's the last few years become a really large problem. Youth violence has reached record levels in some ways, and in fact it was just a couple of years ago that London had more violent crime incidents than New York City did. Also know that 85% of violent crime by individuals who are aged 30 or below. And I was really keen to try to find out more about the initial engage in that, which is why I went to go and volunteer as a youth worker in East London. This was 5 years ago now, working with young people who were involved in crime or at risk of being involved in crime. Aspirations. Many young people I worked with felt backed into crime's corner. In fact, one told me about how he would go and deal drugs or steal bikes and use the cash that he made to secretly slip into his mum's handbag week after week to help her pay the bills. It's a heartbreaking story, and all too many of them across London and beyond. But what was particularly pertinent was the fact that across London, 1 in 5 individuals who are aged between 16 and 24 are not in education, employment, or training. And in fact, that problem is about to get much worse in light of the coronavirus crisis. And what we know, what all of the academic evidence indicates, is that if somebody is in employment, that is the single biggest factor that can reduce their propensity to offend or to reoffend. Now, we might have typically relied on the state, relied on government to provide interventions to help young people into work, to help keep many of them away from being backed into crime's corner. But unfortunately, over the last decade or so, we have seen cuts to public services, which mean that the state isn't as well resourced as it was before to provide those interventions. Now, it seemed clear to me that there was a need to try to harness that cash from somewhere else, get the money pumping in to deliver these interventions from elsewhere. And in my view, it was the case then and still is now even more that social enterprise is a key way of achieving that. Social enterprise involves harnessing a market using business and commercial means to generate social impact. The thing is, though, I had to then think of, well, what market can I introduce or what market could I harness to create an intervention to support people into employment and away from crime? And based on my work as a youth worker, there were several criteria that this market or this trade that we upskilled our young people in needed to meet. First of all, it needed to appeal for their kind of need or sense for instant gratification. Young people would speak to me about how they didn't aspire towards long-term career goals. They didn't think they were going to be alive by the time they were 25. They thought they might get caught up in a gang-based incident or maybe end up incarcerated and not able to enjoy the benefits of society. There also needed to be a genuine market for whatever trade it was that we upskilled them in. It's no good to upskill them in the kind of novelty hobby that I might find interesting in and of itself, because when it comes to making money, which is a real key point to appeal to our young people, it just wouldn't hold. There were several other criteria as well. I wanted it to be something technology based or technology focused. All too many interventions that engage with the so-called naughty kids at school tend to focus on catering and hospitality, or horticulture, or construction, or painting and decorating. And all of these trades are very noble and very needed. But for many of our young people, they just didn't work. They weren't engaging enough. So technology was something that would be interesting, not least because we were in a part of East London where there was lots of tech prosperity, whether it's Old Street in Tech City or Canary Wharf, they didn't feel as though they were a part of it. So there was a growing kind of list of criteria, a checklist that a new intervention would need to reach. And at that point, I started assessing lots of different trades alongside them. Coding was the top of the list. It's quite sexy right now. It has been for a little while. The problem is it didn't quite meet the instant gratification test. It takes By some measures, around 180 hours to learn how to code somewhat proficiently, and even then, not quite enough to be able to make money from it on the market. So that was tossed out. Then came an interesting trade that was maybe fifth or sixth on my list. Smartphone repair, specifically replacing the smashed screens. There are lots of different stats around, but in terms of the size of the market, we estimate that £2 billion a year is what's generated through the repair of smartphones by various elements of research. And what we also know, if you look at some insurance companies, is that 29% of individuals have a smashed smartphone screen. In fact, Motorola estimated that someone somewhere across the world smashes their device on the floor every 2 seconds. And with the average person swiping, scrolling, or touching their device 2,617 times a day, looking at it once every 12 minutes, if you've got a smashed screen, that is a huge inconvenience that I'm sure you, as fixers, have come into contact with from some of the individuals who you've been fixing for. You can make good money from smartphone repair, especially some of the newer devices with OLED screens that you can sell a repair for 100 or 200 pounds in some cases. So there seemed to be quite a lot here. The problem is I had no idea how to fix a phone, and very honestly had no intrinsic interest in how to do so. But I'm a pragmatist, and it seemed to be the case that this could be a market that we could harness to support our young people against this youth violence pandemic. And that's when Cracked It came in. Cracked It comes in at the intersection of repair and the repair market and this youth violence problem. And we, as Hugo said, are London's social enterprise smartphone repair service, staffed by young ex-offenders and young people at risk of offending. And what we do is we start by training young people up in the basics of smartphone repair, so repairing a screen, replacing a battery, and replacing some other internal components like cameras or proximity sensors or microphones. And then what we do is we employ them with a twist. So what we know as well, according to some insurance companies, is that the biggest barrier to repair is convenience or hassle. 76% of people don't repair their phone within 6 months or at all because the existing options are just too inconvenient. You've got to go to the high street or the mall, or you've got to send your phone away for days on end. And many people just don't want to face that barrier to repair. So what we've done is we've taken that insight, and instead what we do is we run pop-up repair clinics in large workplaces across London, setting up a repair shop for a day in a lobby, a cafeteria, or a foyer like this one here in the picture that you can see. And members of staff come in and get their phones repaired with us. And members of staff hail from a series of organisations like those that are listed on the screen now. And I tell you, the US Embassy was a particularly interesting one to try to get our young people, many of whom have criminal convictions, into Trump's embassy. But we managed to get in, and they're fantastic partners of ours. And what's really exciting about being able to work with global organizations like these is not only have we been able to convince them of the merits, if they weren't already, of working with ex-offenders or young people at risk of offending and looking at the talent that they have, but we've also been able to champion the repair agenda rather than the replace and waste agenda. We've been able to show them that through some troubleshooting and through making it as easy as possible for consumers to access a repair, that actually it is the most desirable option, not just for the environment, but for them, which is how we engage people with our cause. And we've had some really exciting successes. We've worked with over 200 young people over the last few years who we've trained up and employed on our program before transitioning them into permanent employment in the wider economy afterwards. and it's seen us recognised in some of the most just unbelievable ways when we consider that this was just a random idea in our heads a few years ago. It's seen us been named in Forbes magazine under their Forbes Under 30, named Social Enterprise of the Year by the Evening Standard, and won us platforms on programs like on the BBC, where we're able to challenge people in government and in politics over the issue of youth offending and champion the merits of repair rather than replace to millions of people live on television. But the most exciting stories are of the very individuals who we train and who we employ. Individuals who, before coming to us, had many, many doors slammed in their faces, who wouldn't be touched with a barge pole because of their pasts. At Cracked It, what we recognise and what we use repair to help advance is that every individual is more than the mistakes that they have made. And what we're able to do through repair, which is a blind process, in the sense that it does not discriminate. It only discriminates against incompetence of repair. It doesn't discriminate against what your past might be. We've been able to use it to empower, to upskill young people, develop repair skills and employability skills more generally, to assist them in their transition into employment. And many of them have made that. And that is what this is about. But something else that's really important, and something else especially that's pertinent now in light of the events that Ugo referred to, is diversity in the repair sector. For us, most of the young people we work with are people of colour, and people of colour are underrepresented in the tech and science, technology, engineering and maths STEM sector. Only about 4% of people in tech workplaces in the UK are of colour. A study done a few years ago found that people who are black are 28% less likely to enter the STEM sector compared to their white counterparts. We're really proud to be doing the work that we're doing to help turn that around. But it's really problematic, the situation that we're in now, and can have quite wide-ranging consequences. There are some that are maybe trivial, it might seem. So this is a screenshot that I took earlier of myself while on a Zoom call. And many of you who have been doing many, many Zoom calls over the last couple of months over lockdown will be familiar with the virtual background option, where rather than display your real background, there are some preset backgrounds, but also ones that you can choose yourself to display behind you. One of the most famous ones is the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. And for many people, when you choose the virtual background option, it automatically changes your actual background. Unfortunately, though, what's quite well documented is that for people of colour, the recognition and the algorithm behind it fails to ascertain what the background actually is. And you can see in my case, the darkest section on the screen is my face, and it's assumed that it's the background. This is only a kind of small example, but maybe if it were the case that there were more people in tech of colour, and more people to screen and test these kind of things and input into these kind of algorithms, the default option wouldn't be a suboptimal outcome for somebody of colour. A very small example, and funny in some ways. But where it starts to get less funny and far more serious is when you consider examples like this.
It's 8:30.
This was a few years ago. And what you can see here is an infrared soap dispenser. And on the left, you can see somebody who is of a white complexion putting their hand under the dispenser and the soap comes out. Somebody with a darker complexion puts their hand under. There's no soap that comes out. Why? Because the infrared is absorbed into the darker person's hand, isn't reflected back into the sensor, and so doesn't trigger the distribution of the soap. Yet when the person of color gets a tissue that's light and puts it under there, it bounces the light back. Now, we can see here again how tech, which can be a real force for something fantastic, is leaving the person of color, the black person, behind. And in a situation like now with coronavirus, where we desperately need contactless soap, for example, if that were to be installed in a workplace and people are asked to go back to the workplace, and a person of color can't get soap out of the machine and thus can't sterilize their hands of potential coronavirus, they are at greater risk, as is everybody around them. And it's for reasons like this that we see that people who are black are 4.2 times more likely to die from coronavirus, as per a Public Health England report that came out earlier this week. Again, might it be the case that if there were more people of color in tech, more than 4% of the sector compared to 13% across the general population, if there were more people of color in the sector, maybe we wouldn't see a problem like this and the inequalities that may stem. Another one when it comes to facial recognition. A study done in the USA put lots of mugshots together from people who were in the police database against mugshots of people just in the general population, and tried to run a face recognition exercise across several or many different face recognition technologies across that were used across the United States, including by law enforcement agencies. What did it find? It found a higher rate of false positives among people of color than people who were not of color. And if this is used by law enforcement agencies, used by them to make assumptions on who they should bring into custody, who they should detain, then we can end up with a really serious problem. If we had more people of color in tech, would the algorithms be different? Would the outcomes be different? In my view, the answer is yes. And so I think you can all see now what I'm building up to, slowly, through some inequalities that might start off very small, become larger and larger and larger, and filter through not just in the kind of bubble that is tech, but permeate lots of different areas of life. Law enforcement, potentially in this one, leading to the kind of scenarios, the kind of systemic racism that underpinned the tragedy of George Floyd's murder just last week. So it really, really is incumbent on us in this community, in this fixer community, in this tech community, to think about how we can act now. How, as well as securing environmental justice that we are very well versed in advocating and acting for, how can we also secure social justice? And a critical part of social justice comes from racial equality when it comes to tech. How can we get more people of color into tech? Well, lots of you have awesome networks and provide awesome opportunities for people to engage with this wonderful world that we so desperately want to share with as many people as possible. Well, have a think. Are there any opportunities that you could offer to people of color in particular? Are there organizations in your communities, whether local authorities, municipal governments, that are able to help you identify local groups that you could engage with to advance this cause? Could you engage with organizations like Colour in Tech that you can collaborate with to create opportunities or filter knowledge that you've accumulated over the years to people of colour? There are so many more ways of being able to act now, but it's really critical, if Black lives are to really matter, that we each consider, what is it that I can do? What is it that my organisation can do to provide opportunities to people from underrepresented backgrounds? What is it that my organization can do to help challenge some of the systemic inequalities that give rise to the Zoom conundrum, to the soap dispensers, to the facial recognition, to the George Floyds? How can you make sure that Black lives really do matter? That's me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Josh. It's hard to just even follow with something meaningful. Luckily, we have questions from people, and I would like to first give the floor to Will Vile. And Will, you can unmute yourself and ask the question directly. Well, if others have other questions, please type in the chat and we can just add you to the list of questions that we're collecting.
Hi, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic.
Yeah, we can.
At first, let me say thank you very much for a really fantastic and insightful presentation there. I thought that was really, really interesting. What I was interested in is whether you track progress of individuals who go through your program into sort of education or employment opportunities, and whether you're seeing more of them try and pursue sort of careers in tech at all, and how far they've been able to get, the ones that have gone through the program so far.
Yes, thank you. That's a really good question. Can you remind me of your name? Because I can't see you on my screen. I'd love to be able to address you.
Oh, sorry. Hi, I'm Will.
Will, thanks a lot. Yes, so in terms of outcomes, this is something that absolutely we do track. So 2/3 of individuals who we work with are in education, employment or training within 6 months of completing our program. 7 in 10 who have offended before don't re-offend within 1 year. And just to put that into perspective, more than half, and depending on which group you look at, 3/4 of people who leave prison do re-offend within 1 year. So we're helping to turn that around. The model that we kind of engage with to achieve that impact is known as the intermediate labour market. And this basically involves the creation of a temporary job in a genuine working environment that serves as a safe space for the young people we work with to learn about the norms and customs of employment and develop what I would describe as pro-social values. These are kind of values that it's necessary to understand and abide by in great measure to properly engage at the core of society rather than the margins. So examples include sensitive communication, conflict management, cooperation, compromise. So those are some of the outcomes from our program. In terms of transition into or what kind of roles and jobs people transition into afterwards. So we are agnostic about the kind of sectors that people end up in, but of course, the very skills that we are equipping them with are very applicable to the tech world. But we've had young people move into tech. We've had young people, go and become technicians at Computer Exchange, CEX, for example. But then we've also had one of our graduates became a toy demonstrator at Hamley's Toy Store. So it really varies. I can't remember. There might have been another bit of your question, Will, that I didn't answer. But if that is the case, please do let me know. But if not, thank you for your question.
Thanks, Josh. I believe we have a question by Stuart next.
Hi, yeah, Stuart Ward. I help run the Reading Repair Cafe. how do I get Crack to come along to my employer, my business, my town, whatever, to run a session?
Thanks for your question, Stuart. So there's a couple of different things there. I mean, first and foremost, our core activity is in London currently. The reason for that is because there are two parts to what we do. First is the training up young people. The second is the repair work itself. In terms of the training up, we work with local authorities who pay us essentially to conduct that training. And that gives us the kind of pipeline of repair talent, if you like, that we then deploy in the second bit. So it's important that there is that commissioning in place from a local authority in whatever area we would go into, and a pipeline of that repair talent from the kind of ex-offender community or youth at risk community. The second criteria around the repairing itself is, I mean, this very much applied pre-COVID. We're now having to really assess our model post-COVID. But pre-COVID, going into large workplaces was the kind of sweet spot, really. We didn't have to pay any rent to have what was a prime location for a captive audience in a large workplace. And what it also meant is we didn't really spend anything on marketing. We built great relationships with all of the workplaces that we served, and great relationships with their internal communications team. So they would send out emails to all their staff, or put a message on their intranet or whatever, so that people would come down and book an appointment with us and get a repair. And we have set a kind of bar, if you like, of only serving buildings that have 1,000 or more people in them, along with a strong internal communications infrastructure. Otherwise, we just don't make enough money for it to be sustainable. So if, Stuart, that those kind of two criteria were met where you're based, then definitely we could have a discussion. But something to bear in mind is that with workplaces closed at the moment, and working from home likely being a thing to stay to some extent, we may further need to revise our model, and it could look completely different. So I give you a sneak preview. Something that we're getting ready to launch next week is a kind of collect and repair service. Collect it from your house, take it to our HQ, which is just outside Canary Wharf, and then drop it back to you later on once we've repaired it. So definitely get in touch, Stuart. I can share, or I've shared my Twitter handle, and I'll post it again in the comments if that's useful. And if you think there's scope for collaboration, great, we can chat and see where we get. Yeah,
I work in near Paddington, so yeah, that we would meet your criteria, I think, quite easily. And there's lots of high-tech companies around us as well, Vodafone, Orange, people like that. So I'm sure they would be, we could communicate them. But you say, I presume that you're almost closed down at the moment in terms of with the offices all closed. So how are you coping with that situation? Are you just closed for the period, or are you able to do something at all, something in the interim?
So, I mean, business as usual has been paused, as it has for all of us. But what we have done is repurposed our skills and our resources to support people during this pandemic. So one of the key things that we've done is we have appealed to a lot of our corporate partners for donations of old devices that they would otherwise have thrown away, and that we could bring back to life. We've done that, and a really big problem that we've wanted to match them to and have matched them to is surrounding care homes. Care homes are in a really difficult position, or the people in them are in a difficult position, because the residents are at especially high risk if they were to catch the virus. And as a result, their families are not allowed to visit because of the virus. And it totally makes sense, but absolutely heartbreaking that many of these elderly people who, if we're being very brutal about this, we don't know how long they're going to be with us for. There are many families who haven't been able to say goodbye. They've not been able to see their relatives. So what we've done is we've taken these donated phones, we've refurbished them, and we've donated them to care homes, so that residents in those homes can have video calls with their families during the pandemic, so that they're not cut off, they're not 100% isolated, and so there is some kind of way of families being able to keep connected and in some cases say goodbye.
Brilliant. We're running a little bit behind schedule, so we have one final, hopefully quick question from Frank on the scalability of Cracked It, and then we move on to part 2.
Yeah. Hi, Josh. Thanks very much for the talk. It was great. Thank you very much. So just a quick question. I think to some extent you've answered it already. It's about the scalability of the model. Do you think it can be repeated in other places as well?
Short answer is, well, a short pre-COVID answer. It's not clear post-COVID. But if you'd have asked me this, this time 3 months ago, absolutely yes. So long as we were to meet the conditions that I set out in response to Stuart's question. So there must be that pipeline of talent in each community, for example, we'd serve, if scaling is about actually taking it to just different cities. But also in each of those places, there need to be, a high concentration of large workplaces with strong internal communications infrastructure. What's very lucky, or not lucky, we've made our own luck in some ways, but the workplaces that we serve are global corporations. So I've spoken to, well, we work, with them in London, but I've spoken to, for example, the Washington DC counterparts or the New York City counterparts of Deutsche Bank and EY and PwC, for example, with a view to assessing whether it might be able to work in their organizations. The pipeline of talent tends to be there, but it's the high concentration of workplaces. But what this has taught us is that, it isn't sustainable to rely on that very lean model alone. Who could have predicted that a global pandemic would reverse the trend of, large skyscrapers housing the world's largest firms that we happen to serve? And yeah, we definitely need to diversify, whether that's by doing kind of more B2B repairs rather than just repairing the personal devices of individuals in these organizations, although we do some of it already. But we need to look for other different routes now, which is why, as I've said, we're exploring this, well, we're launching next week, the very consumer-centric model of going to people's homes, collecting their devices and repairing them. So yes, there's lots of really interesting scalability potential, some of which we've pursued already, but coronavirus throws a spanner in the works.
Thanks again. And Josh, we truly hope that your words of inspiration, that you've provoked us with, will also help us throughout the whole of Fixfest UK. Thanks again, and we hope you can stay with us for the rest of this evening. So we are now moving to part 2 of our session, and I'm really delighted to have Libby Peake joining us from the Green Alliance. Restart and Green Alliance have collaborated for quite a while now, just sharing insights and seeing what can be done in the UK to push forward an agenda around repair. Before giving the floor to Libby, I want to just zoom out for a second and have a quick flashback to the Manchester Declaration. So back in 2018, when we launched the Manchester Declaration at Fixfest in Manchester, obviously, and this, you can, if you do not come across the declaration, you can see a link for it in the slide, and it's now been signed by 58 community repair groups from across the UK. It's received 13 political endorsements, and it's been co-signed by 20 organizations of allies, including Green Alliance and Cracked It, among others. And just to bring it to life, I just wanted to ask one of the few signatories that are here with us tonight that actually managed to their MP to endorse the declaration, to just tell us what it meant to actually connect the local and the UK-wide aspect of their work, like, together. And so I'd like to check if either Claire Seek from Portsmouth or Dave Carlos can just share their experience. Who's first to activate their mic?
Dave Carlos here.
Great, Dave. Please introduce yourself, what group you're representing, and what happened with your MP.
Okay, a pleasure. Dave Carlos from the West Fleetwood Computer Clinic. We started about 6 years ago providing a community service fixing technology for those in the local community. Fleetwood is an interesting place. It has one of the lowest life expectancy figures in the UK. So when we saw the Manchester Declaration, we chose to sign. And then when we had the opportunity to interface with our MP, we chose to take it. It was actually a relatively simple operation. We used the letter that was proposed on the right to repair and sent it off to the MP. She came back to me a couple of days later and said, I'd like to meet you and let's talk about it. So we made the appointment. I went to see her and I decided I'd try and engage her in a slightly different way, perhaps to usual. And I took 2 items with me. And I said to her, I want to show you the problem. And I took an iPhone, and in front of her, I took it apart and replaced the battery. Relatively easy repair, the kind of thing that Cracked It are doing all the time. And I did it right in front of her that day. And then I handed her an iPad and I said to her, okay, now fix that. Even better, find a way into it. And she looked at it, absolutely baffled, as you'd expect, and immediately said, there isn't a chance, is there? And I said, no, not at all. There is. It's a very complex thing. It can be done, but it's extremely difficult. And so this manufacturer has chosen to make 2 products in the same range, one of which you can repair relatively easily, tricky, but relatively easily. The other one, which is almost impossible. She immediately said, as far as I'm concerned, this was pre-COVID, there is only one agenda in the political world at the moment, and that's the green agenda. That is the climate. On that basis, I will sign your Manchester Declaration immediately. It was genuinely that simple, and we were delighted with the result.
Brilliant. I didn't know the details of how this unfolded. It's brilliant. So without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Libby to give us an update on what's happening with the UK. What are our hopes of pushing forward right to repair legislation going forward?
Well, thanks very much, Hugo. Thanks for inviting me to speak today, and to Josh for his really amazing keynote speech, which, as Hugo noted, is quite a difficult thing to follow, but I'm going to try. I'm going to talk a bit about some of the research that we've done and some of the policy context that we've all got to work in if we're going to make sure that right to repair becomes a reality. For those of you who don't know us, which I imagine is a lot of you, Green Alliance is a charity and think tank that focuses on achieving ambitious leadership for the environment. And I lead our work on the resource stewardship theme, which includes things like the circular economy. The research that I'm going to be talking about was from a project that we did in collaboration with the University of Cardiff and the Centre for Industrial Energy Materials and Products. And it was looking at what people thought about different sorts of resource efficiency policies, some of which are definitely related to the right to repair. And it was done through a big online survey, as well as a couple in-depth focus groups where people got to talk about the things that they think are important and the concerns that they have about it. And it was then published in a report that was called By Popular Demand. So this was based on the survey results and the survey question. And it was a question to people about whether or not they liked the sound of more resource efficiency. And basically everyone thought that the economy and society should be using resources more efficiently. There was only 0.4% of people who thought that it shouldn't. And I'm not sure what those people were thinking. And then it was when they were asked if they would change their lifestyle to support better use of resources. Again, lots of people said yeah. 60% of people said that they were willing to make changes to their life, which I think is quite a promising statistic. And then they were asked about different sorts of policies. So Ugo, if you could go on to the next slide. We broke the different questions down into different sorts of strategies that you might implement. The first of which was improving design. Improving design. And by improving design, we asked them about reducing packaging and making it more recyclable, products and packaging lightweighting, and also using more modular and repairable design. So this bit is definitely relevant to the right to repair. And this was pretty much everything in this section was universally popular. People really wanted it. And if you look at some of the questions that they were asked, people wanted government to take a lot more control. So 75% of people said that the government should be responsible for ensuring that businesses produce more repairable and recyclable products. And people were even more keen on recyclable packaging, which is something that we do see a lot. But they also had quite strong views on things like inbuilt obsolescence, where people were determined that or convinced that some things aren't designed to be fixed anyway, which I'm sure a lot of you out there have a lot of experience for. And in terms of the government not getting more involved, they said that it's bonkers that they're not doing it. And the second thing that people were asked about that's definitely related to right to repair is about extending product lifetimes. And here again, a lot of people were very much in favor of more government action and business action. But people basically want more repairable products and for businesses to be made to provide them. And then we also asked about sharing products, which people liked, but they were a bit apprehensive about sharing with people who they don't necessarily trust or know in terms of their hygiene product standards. And that was even before COVID came along. So you'd expect that those sorts of concerns are going to be amplified now. And then if you go on to the next slide, slide number 8, it found that the different sorts, we also quantified the carbon savings that could be had from these sorts of policies. And I'm sure you'll all appreciate the material savings that repair can have. But we find it's quite useful when we're talking to the government to also quantify the different carbon savings, because the government does have legally binding targets to reduce carbon emissions. And it found that the popular strategies of sharing products and extending lifetimes and changing designs altogether could reduce the footprint of a lot of household products by 40%. And so they're not insignificant carbon savings. And I think that's another string to our bow that we should be presenting to government and policymakers so that they know why this sort of thing is so important. If you could just go on to the last slide, I'll talk briefly about the policy context, because it's basically universal that everybody wants more right to repair. Everyone thinks it's mad that it's not happening. And I bet if you spoke to politicians and policymakers about their personal lives, they would also say the same thing. But as someone who's coming from a policy background and who's works in a policy-focused think tank, I would say that I think one of the main reasons that it's not been happening yet is because we haven't got the policies and legislation in place to incentivize not only repairable products, but also the services and business models that are going to then repair them. And insofar as we've had any policy in the product area so far, it's mainly been driven by at the EU level. There was something that I'm sure Ugo is going to touch upon, which is called the Eco Design Directive, which has, for the most part, been focused on making our electronics and energy using products more energy efficient, which is really important. But obviously, there's also things to do with resource efficiency as well, which the Eco Design Directive is starting to look at now. And I know Ugo is going to touch on this as well, but the EU has also just launched an EU Circular Economy Action Plan, which does promise to establish a right to repair, to counter premature obsolescence, and to strengthen protection against greenwash. So there's lots of good things in there. And so in the past, we've really benefited from this collaboration with the EU, and these different product standards have applied to us, but there are definite questions about what's going to happen in the future. The government has said on multiple occasions that they're going to at least meet and preferably exceed any standards that the EU brings in through the Eco Design Directive. And they've said that they want to make sure that products are more repairable and things like that. The frustrating thing, though, is that they haven't so far put it into law, and they've got an opportunity to put it into law. There's a bill that's in Parliament at the moment. It's been paused because of coronavirus, but we're expecting it back soon. And they could put in that law something about non-regression at the very least, and to make sure that we do continue to at least match those EU standards in the future. And I'm sure we'll get stuck into a lot of the other tactics that we might take and think about what we can do to push the government to put its commitments into legislation. But I'll hand over to you now, Ugo, to talk about that a bit.
Thank you so much, Libby. From what I understand, there's a lot of opportunities, but there's also potentially a lot of frustration with the risk that things could go backwards, actually, in the post-Brexit, post-transition period leading to real Brexit. So I'll suggest that if people like to pile up, suggest questions for Libby or for the whole rest of the session, please add your name to the chat. I'm going to give a very quick update on what we've been working on at European level, and so that then we can kind of zoom back into the future of the Manchester Declaration and how can the network of UK community repair groups be a voice of change in this conversation. I'll share a few slides quickly. Oops, not this. Apologies. Right. So there's been a growing movement for right to repair globally, actually. And in Europe, we've been quite involved in the last couple of years. It all started from one day in December 2018, when some of us got together in Brussels with a sad face fridge in front of an EU building. And we were campaigning for the eco-design regulations that Libby mentioned to be an inclusive way to bring together repairability and right to repair for the first time in legislation. And we got an initial victory so that in Europe, from next year, fridges, washing machines, dishwashers, electronic screens, and lighting will have some repairability provisions by legislation for every new product and sold in the EU. That was the beginning, and over the last year, this has turned into a coalition involving now 34 organizations across 13 countries in Europe, including Restart and the Green Alliance in the UK. And Restart being one of the co-founders of the whole coalition. And Right to Repair, I think it's important that we kind of quickly look at what we mean by it, because it obviously makes sense, but it means different things to different people. And we try to bring together what the different things we'd like to see. And first and foremost, we need products to be designed so that they can be repaired. And we need universal access to spare parts and repair manuals so that everyone can make repair whenever is needed. And so, of course, Libby mentioned that the Circular Economy Action Plan seems an ambitious way to extend such regulations and make it more universal to be able to repair products like smartphones and laptops next. And the campaign has played a role in making this a priority. But at UK level, will we see alignment to these future regulations, and how can we ensure that? Another element which is currently not as strong as we'd like it to be in terms of campaigning at a European level is that repair should be accessible, affordable, and mainstream. So it should be the norm. So at European level, there is a push for ensuring that so-called national registries will allow as many repairers as possible to access spare parts and repair information. But there is nothing about how can we make repair really affordable and low cost. So at UK level, what could be the fiscal measures that could help make that happen? Would a reduction or removal of VAT on repair work? Or could we look at other models in other countries where there's fiscal incentives to reduce the cost of repair? And finally, there's an element of informing consumers. So making sure that people, when they buy a product, they know whether that's repairable or not, and what are the most repairable products. So there's very slow progress happening at European level, but that means maybe there is an opportunity for doing things in a different way. We know that France is launching a repairability index for some initial product categories in 2021. Could the UK be next and be faster than the EU at all of this? You can follow the European campaign at repair.eu and sign up for its newsletter. I will stop sharing the slides and actually try to open the floor, because the question is really, how can we take forward the work that we started with our powerful, hopefully, letter that set the scene for how we want to reduce all barriers to repair. But what does it mean in practice? How do we push this to be a strong aspect of future green agenda in the UK? Libby, what do you think in terms of how the work that we did in combining community groups with organizations that don't necessarily have repair at the core of their agenda and an initial set of politicians? What's next? How do we make this a real voice for change?
Well, obviously, it's something that we should be able to hopefully bring to the government and make them realize how important it is to everyone, because The statistics about who cares about this are really overwhelming, but then the anecdotal evidence that you get about how people are personally affected by it are also really overwhelming. And so the personal connection to the issue should be really quite compelling. I think that also the fact that we're leaving the EU and we've said that we're going to be better than the EU in some ways is potentially a tool that could be used, that should be used, to sort of induce an arms race of sorts between the two governments to make sure that to try to determine who's doing more on the environment. And we did see that once a little while ago when Michael Gove was the Secretary for the Environment. He got into a little spat with his counterpart in the EU on Twitter, where they were each trying to say this wasn't about repairing products, but it was about plastics, which is another really popular issue with the public. And they got into a spat where each was saying, we're doing more on plastics than you are. And I think if you can encourage, point to what the EU is doing to the UK government, that is potentially quite powerful, because they don't want to be shown up in the post-Brexit Britain. I'd say that there are a number of other tools that we could also use. One of the things that's quite important about repair is that it does provide a lot of jobs, and we were hearing from Josh earlier, of course, that it provides a lot of training opportunities. And after COVID, you're going to expect that that's going to be even more important, because there's going to be a massive increase in unemployment, and the sorts of jobs, the sort of jobs that could be created through the circular economy are actually quite numerous. We've done some research looking at circular economy jobs, which wasn't restricted just to repair, but repair was certainly a lot of it, and remanufacturing actually was the bulk of it. And we found that if you go for a really transformative scenario in the UK, where we're really doing the most we can with products and resources, then you could create over 100,000 net jobs right across the country at different skill levels. And it would most benefit those areas that have high unemployment. And that's actually, it's 102,000 net jobs and more than 500,000 gross jobs if we really go for it. So we're hoping that this evidence that we've been accumulating over a long period of time is even more compelling now that we know that the economy needs a lot of help.
Great, very, very interesting point about actually creating local jobs. I believe we have a question from Stuart on Brexit.
So not so much on Brexit, but more on, we seem to be battling against big companies. The sort of it's a David and Goliath type of battle. What we should really have is big companies behind us and promoting repair and saying, it's a plus point that might, buy a device from us and it's repairable. How can we sort of shift it around? We've got, the opposite happening, Massey Ferguson, sort of a case in point where you'd think that tractors should be repairable and farmers have a big incentive to be able to repair their own tractors, and yet Massey Ferguson are denying repair to farmers. I don't know how we can change this around, but I'm sure you've got some ideas.
Well, I mean, the most obvious way would be if government got behind the idea that there should be right to repair and legislated for it, then businesses would have to do it and they would get used to it. Like when we introduced some of the eco-design directive requirements, there was resistance from some industries. And in fact, as the EU is continuing to develop those different standards, there is still resistance from industry, but because it's been deemed important by the different governments, and they're not ignoring the businesses, but they're realizing the bigger picture behind it and taking some of their objections with a pinch of salt. So I think that's the easiest answer. I'm not sure if it's necessarily going to happen, but in the absence of that, I do think that it's important to work with the more progressive businesses and the ones that because there are some that do think that this sort of thing is important. And we've got the Cool Products Coalition, which it was quite a while ago now, but we did, which was talking about the EU Eco-Design Directive, and put out a joint statement with, I think, Bosch and Philips and Electrolux, calling for better standards for products. And so I think working with the leaders who recognize that there will be benefits from creating long-lasting repairable products could potentially be powerful as well.
Great. We have quite a few other questions. One from Janet for Libby. I don't know if Janet, you'd like to ask it yourself?
Oh, hi. It's probably just a really simple question, but that statistic on popular support for government intervention, it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of generally popular support for government intervening in markets, just given, this is the time we're living in. Is that statistic really as extraordinary as it seems, to me anyway?
I mean, it's overwhelming. I don't think it's the only overwhelming statistic out there, but I think that the raw figures combined with all of the personal statements that people will make about it is quite compelling. I mean, I think at the moment we are seeing, or at least pre-COVID, we were seeing plenty of really compelling statistics about giving government permission to act on climate change more generally. So 4 out of 5 people were saying that it was the most important issue. There was a lot more concern growing, and we had an interesting presentation from Ipsos Mori, from Ben Page, the CEO of Ipsos Mori, who was going through all these different statistics and saying that these popular opinions give the government latent permission to act, and the government might be afraid, and they might think that that there would be more pushback than there necessarily would. And one of the examples that he used was, so I suppose the point that he was making is, even when you don't have such overwhelming support for something, the government does potentially in some instances have more leeway to act than it thinks it might. And the statistic that he used was, one of the examples that he used rather, was about the introduction of the charging in London for the emission zone, the low emission zone. And for that, actually, the polling would have suggested that people didn't want that to come into effect, but they didn't actually publish any polls before they implemented the charge, and people just accepted it. So I think in a lot of instances, government is more afraid of pushback in areas where, especially like this, where everyone wants it. There won't be as much pushback as they might expect. So I do think that that government can be bolder, and it certainly should be bolder, not least given the need to get to net zero emissions around the world, and the role that reducing in the levels of e-waste could play in doing that.
Excellent. Thank you. I believe there's a question from Arthur on double counting and greenhouse gas emissions.
So, question. I hope it doesn't go into too much specificity here, but I come from a background in science, and I now work in consulting, and I think reproducibility and kind of the accuracy of the figures which are used in estimating, for instance, the impacts of a policy are quite challenged at the moment. So, for instance, there's double counting in the European emissions trading scheme, and a lot of data that we rely on to calculate greenhouse gas emissions is siloed behind paywalls. I can understand reasons, of course, in terms of funding for doing that, but it is an issue, and I wonder if perhaps governments could step in a bit more to make sure that data is open. Do you have any ideas for policies that could help with that?
So yeah, I mean, a lack of reliable data hampers action in lots of different ways, and you're right that there are some real questions about the reliability of data. It's certainly when you're talking about doing life cycle assessments and saying what the impacts of different products are. On that, we've made some recommendations on what the government should do in terms of life cycle assessments, which is to mandate that everyone who is releasing or making claims about a life cycle assessment has to do it to an international standard. So there's an ISO standard for doing life cycle assessments, and then also has to make the information publicly available, because I mean, this is a problem with greenwashing, not just in this sort of area, but in all sorts of, in any sort of product area. People can say a lot of things without necessarily having data to back them up. So we would say things should only be allowed on the market, or should only be allowed to make claims on the market if they're done to an internationally recognized standards, and they make their different findings available to the public. And I think there would still be, if you're doing life cycle assessments, they're really, really complicated, and a lot of the final outcomes they're going to depend on where you set the parameters and assumptions that you make. So I think setting a sort of really rigorous, standardized way of doing those assessments is quite difficult, but ensuring that they're at least done to an ISO standard in the first instance, we think should be fairly easily done.
Thank you. We have a question from Steve Cousins.
Sorry. Hi, Libby. Great presentation. Very interesting. I was interested to hear what you said about the UK and the EU. So that's partly answered one of my questions. So I wanted to expand that a little bit, although I'm very much interested in repair, running a repair cafe here in the Midlands. But one of the additional problems we've got here in the countryside is litter. And whether you've had any policy thoughts about returnable cans and bottles, and even what I think is a wonderful idea of making takeaway places put to the registration number perhaps of cars on packaging that gets thrown away in the lanes near where we live, and potentially then levying fines, etc. EU seem to do it pretty well. I've spent a lot of time in Nordic countries, and they've been doing that, certainly return of bottles and so on, for years, but we just don't seem to have the motivation. What are your views on that? Thank you.
No problem. I'm pleased to be able to tell you that change is on its way, actually, and that some of those policies are due to be implemented. So the government had a resources and waste strategy in 2018. I mean, and it did mention things like eco-design and repair and ensuring that they incentivize resource-efficient business policies. But actually, the only thing that they've consulted on really so far is on packaging and on recycling. And so they've promised to implement a deposit return scheme on drinks bottles. They've promised to reform extended producer responsibility, which means that people who place packaging in the first instance, but this will then move on to other products, but people who place packaging on the market will be responsible for 100% of the cost of its end-of-life treatment, and that includes litter. So that's going to really change the incentives for businesses anyway to make sure that they're designing things in the right way, and that they're setting up a system so that they can collect things again. So hopefully that's going to come to pass. I'd say that there are some questions about how it's going to be designed ultimately and when it's going to come into effect. The second round of consultations that the government was due to run were meant to happen in February this year, and now we're hearing that it might not be until February next year that we hear it, and so the implementation of these schemes might be some way down the line. But these are actually things that the government has said it is going to implement, unlike the right to repair. So I suppose that's a positive thing to take away.
Thank you.
Great, thank you very much.
We have one more question from Robert. Probably final question.
Hi.
Hi, Robert.
Yeah, we have quite a strong organisation in the Consumers Association, the publishers of which, who don't seem to be there yet with repairing and sewing and so on of kit. Is there any? They're quite a strong organisation. Shouldn't there be somebody that we are approaching and getting on side?
That That's a really good question. I'm happy to respond. We've been in touch quite a bit with Which over the last year, and I agree with you that they should be a strong voice of change. Consumer consumer organizations have been making a lot of progress towards right to repair. However, they still come from the perspective that consumers should have access to reliable products, and whether the product get replaced with very quickly if people have a problem, or it gets full marks for repairability, has not been a massive concern historically from them. We've seen Which come to terms with the importance of repairability a bit more, and they've hosted at least one opinion piece on their blog from us. But for example, they've not joined the Manchester Declaration yet. We'd like to approach them further, and I think hearing that's also your concern is quite inspirational. I wonder whether Libby has any views on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think Which is very powerful, and they do go along to the government's eco-design stakeholder forum, and I've been in various sessions with them, so they should, in some ways, at least one person within Which should be plugged into this, and if we can get to the right person, then I think that should be a powerful ally. I would say as well, we haven't touched on who else we should be approaching for the Manchester Declaration. Excuse me, but I was just thinking about the politicians, and inspired by the story earlier about approaching the politicians. I think that it would be quite powerful if we got more people from different political spectrums, and probably preferably backbench conservatives signed up, because I know you've got a full sweep on the Greens, you've got a lot of other opposition MPs, but I think there's, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's only one Conservative MP, and Conservatives will be quite concerned about this as well. I'm sure that most Conservative MPs have stories of having an electronic brake before they wanted it to. So tapping into that and seeing if you can get any more signed on, I think would be potentially be quite powerful. And the Conservative Environment Network is quite a strong caucus within the Conservative Party. So definitely worth looking into those, especially the new cohort. A lot of them are avowed environmentalists. So see. I think that's another potentially really useful group of people to get signed on to make the change happen.
Thanks very, very much for that. I know we're running out of time, but I wanted to, as we reflect on how to bring more politicians on, I think we also need to reflect on how our campaigning should continue at local level as well. And if she's still with us, I believe she is, I'd like to just ask, probably as a closing thought to inspire us further, Claire Seek from Repair Cafe Portsmouth to tell us how they brought Right to Repair to the street as part of Climate Strike.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Great. Okay. Hi, everybody. Obviously, before COVID, we were really excited to get involved with the Long Live My Phone campaign, and took it to our climate strikes in Portsmouth. And what we found really interesting was it was an idea that some of you guys had, was kind of chalking out a sort of dead smartphone on the floor, a bit like a crime scene. And then we had lots of little markers with facts on how many smartphones get bought every day and all that kind of stuff. And because we just left it in this massive kind of space in Portsmouth where people walk through, they stopped because we weren't sort of right in their face. And I have to confess, I then used my children unashamedly to then, once people had stopped and mingled, to go up and go, great, would you like to sign our petition? Because this is about our future and that kind of thing. So it's always good to use the kids, I find. But we had a really good response to signing, the European petition. It was also something we then did at our repair cafes as well, whilst people were sitting there waiting for kind of things to be repaired. We engaged people on topics, and people are really, as Libby said, people are really passionate about it, and everybody had a story to tell us about, a phone that they couldn't repair or a frustration around that. So it's great to be involved with the strikes, and obviously we'll have to see how they re-emerge. We've got a new protest banner even for Right to Repair and Repair Cafe on it. So we're hoping to have that waved outside very soon.
Brilliant. That's really great to hear. And we'll be all thinking about how can we take the agenda forward in all of our events, in all of our towns and cities and neighborhoods. And I just wanted to quickly wrap up the main points that have emerged from this Right to Repair session. And so first, there's an overwhelming mandate for government action, and public opinion is definitely on our side. It's the same actually across the whole of Europe, we've seen. And so we need to use that to our advantage. And we should consider the importance of promoting a repair jobs agenda and use data for this, especially given what's been going on with COVID and how we can look at building new jobs that are real resilient jobs for the future. Then the key important point about joining forces as much as possible with the consumer rights organizations, and we'll reach back out to which and see how we can work better with them. And the point that Libby just made on actually reaching out to all of the backbench conservatives through the Conservative Environment Network. And I would add to that we'd like to see all political parties. We'd like to see people in Scotland, politicians endorse it. We'd like to see people in Wales and people in Northern Ireland, everywhere, and people from all parties. So this is just to energize us, actually, to think through how can we expand the work of the declaration. And I wanted to thank all of the speakers and all the people that have contributed to the success. I mean, you've seen me speak, but from the Restart side, there's been like a team effort that's been wonderful. And between summarizing the points that have been made that you can see on the Etherpad, recording the session and highlighting things for social media sharing, and we'll be publishing the video as soon as we can and doing a bit of editing. And I want to remind you that the chat will remain open after the session. So if you have any specific question about Right to Repair or the work that Josh presented earlier, you can keep using the chat throughout the whole of Fixfest. And well, I want to also remind you that we will be back with the next session of Fixfest on the 11th, next week on Thursday, with a session on community repair in the UK, strengthening a decentralized network. That will be led by my co-founder, Janet. And thank you again. It's been really exciting and so inspiring to see that at 9:30 p.m., 68 of you are still with us. It's been a delight. And thanks again, Josh, for really inspiring us and reminding us to think about the big picture as we start this edition of Fixfest UK. Thanks, and have a great evening, everyone.